All right, this is a big week. It is a very big week for two things in particular that I want to talk about. And I don't know how long we're going to go today, but I've got a lot of stuff I want to cover and a bunch of stuff that I want to clarify via this channel as well, which I think is a better way for sort of expressing tone and sentiment and everything than writing, as careful as I am when I write. Now, the two really big things are the two cloud things, the Cloudflare thing and the CloudPets thing. And we're going to do them in chronological order. So, Cloudflare. Now, while I was recording my update bang on about 1 week ago, there were some things happening with Cloudflare. Now, to take a step back for a moment, Cloudflare is a reverse proxy service. You set it up so that your website, when someone goes to www. whatever, you're effectively hitting their edge node, which then relays your request back to your origin. It means that they can give you HTTPS, so they can give you a TLS certificate, they can cache stuff, they can block bad stuff. There's a lot of things you can do with the reverse proxy. I've written a lot about Cloudflare before because I really like many of the premises of using the service. One of the things I really like is that they offer it for free, and then you can pay money and get more stuff. But for free, you can take a few minutes and you go and get HTTPS and caching and all these other neat performance things. So I've always been really happy with the service. Now, about this time last week, the news broke of this Cloudbleed bug. And people were calling it Cloudbleed because, first of all, apparently a bug's got to have a scary name these days, or a good name. And of course, as well as a good name, it's got to have a logo. And we can all thank Heartbleed a few years ago for that. But like Heartbleed, there was this premise that data from a memory position other than the one you're meant to be getting stuff from can be leaked and can be returned to unauthorized parties. And what eventually sort of turned out to be the case here is that there were certain conditions that we'll talk about in a moment whereby a web page requested over Cloudflare or requested through Cloudflare could possibly result in the response returning a little bit of data from a request to a totally unrelated website, which is bad. I mean, it's really bad, right? Like, no matter how we try and sugarcoat it, let's call it what it is. It's a bad thing. Now, let's talk about how that actually happened, what the impact was, and what companies are actually doing about it. And then we'll talk about how much people lost their minds over it. So, what was happening here was that it turned out that a very small number of web pages, and the number I've seen on this was 0.06%. 0.06% of web pages had some screwy markup right at the end of the document. And by screwy markup, we mean imagine that you had, say, a script tag and you went open angle bracket script, and then you put in, say, an attribute, and then you didn't close the tag, right? So no closing angle bracket. And that was the very last thing in the document. So effectively, your document just bombed out at that point. Now, clearly, this is a screwy thing to do in a document, and this is why it didn't happen very frequently. The problem is that Cloudflare parse these documents on the fly. Now, they do this because there are multiple things that they do with the pages. So, for example, one of the things they do is they have an email obfuscation process where you can turn on a feature which says, if there are any email addresses on this page, I want to prevent them from being scraped by bots. Fair enough, some people want to keep their email addresses out. There are other performance bits and pieces, other optimizations, other reasons why they need to read traffic on the fly and modify it. Now, of course, when you're trying to read this traffic on the fly and make changes to it, speed is really essential. And they used Ragel for many years in order to write these optimizations and then run them in Nginx as modules. Now, what they did is they built a bit of bad code. So they built a bit of bad code in their Ragel, which when executed meant that there could be a buffer overrun. So effectively try and read memory from a place beyond the array in which the memory was stored. Now, due to the way the Ragel implementation worked, this bug never manifested itself. So it never actually resulted in memory being read from beyond the scope it was intended to be retrieved from. Then they went, all right, we're going to move away from Ragel. We're going to upgrade to what we're calling CF-HTML. And this was going to be a new parser, a new little module which would sit in there and do the same sorts of things. And they took their code that they had in Ragel, put it into CFHTML, and the bug was triggered. Because now circumstances were such, planets aligned, that that memory could actually be retrieved from places it wasn't meant to be grabbed from. So the bottom line was they had a latent bug. It eventually arose and bit them in the backside. Now, this is where it sort of gets really interesting because we go, okay, well, it's not good to read memory from someone else's requests. They have said that this impacted 1 in about 3.3 million requests, which is a very small number. So now we start to have the discussion about, all right, this is bad, but what's the probability? Because something can be bad with a very, very small probability and it's not too bad, right? If it's bad and a very high probability of going wrong, very different situation. So they've gone, okay, 1 in about 3.3 million requests. And obviously what they've done is they've looked at the number of pages that are malformed, the number of requests that are actually going there. And that's one thing that they can get shape around. Now, a lot of this discussion is about what we can and can't measure, because this is the big thing, right? This is the big ambiguity. In fact, one of the points I make in my blog post is the biggest problem we've got here. What exactly did I say, actually? I think I said the biggest problem we've got is that we can't measure it. The problem is that we just can't measure it. And this is the challenge, right? So you're going, okay, about 1 in 3.3 million requests, those odds are pretty good. You have got better odds of winning the lottery. And, you know, it depends which lottery and all this sort of thing. But 1 in 3.3 million, we'd all go is pretty good. If someone said, you've got a disease, there's a 1 in 3.3 million chance it might kill you, you'd go, I'm pretty happy with those odds. I think I'm going to make it. So this is important. Now, the next thing is that if that did trigger and it leaks something, what can it leak? Well, it's leaking information from the request. So if it's a post request, we could have passwords in there. Not so good. You don't want to leak passwords. If it's any sort of request where it's an authenticated session and there's an auth cookie in there and someone grabs that, well, then now we have this risk of session hijacking. Also not so good, because if you're hijacking sessions, you can effectively take over someone else's session and impersonate them. Bad news. So there are a couple of probably the worst things that can happen, but then you go, okay, well, 1 in 3.3 million requests. When you think about all the requests that you make to a website, how many are actually sending passwords? Well, there's when you log in, that'll be the most common one. Also when you register, also when you change your password. So that's out of the whole broad spectrum of requests, not really that many, because a lot of requests are going to be to images and style sheets, to other HTML pages after you've already authenticated. So now we're saying that the risk of leaking passwords is some subset of 1 in 3.3 million, probably about 1 in 100 if you think about how many requests you make and how many actually contain passwords. Auth tokens, a little bit more common, because once you authenticate, that token is going to be sent back with every single request, because that's what cookies do. Unless, of course, you're talking about requests that go off to a CDN or something that's separate CDN to Cloudflare, different host name, and the cookies aren't valid for it. Be that as it may, you're going to have more requests that have auth tokens, and even then it's going to be a subset of that 1 in 3.3 million. So when you sort of start to think about this more and more, the chances of losing something valuable start to look really, really small. So it begs the question, what should you do, right? Like, what should you do if you're a Cloudflare customer? A bunch of Cloudflare customers, apparently about 150, had data which was discoverable in search engine caches. Now, this is bad news, and have a think about it, right? You've got a search engine that's crawling around the web. Every now and then it hits one of these dodgy Cloudflare pages with the broken syntax and the unterminated tag, and a little bit of data leaks from somewhere else. Now, we were finding this in cache. When I say we, I'm not Cloudflare. They were finding things. A bunch of us, as we were searching around the web, found abstracts of this or fragments of it. And what they were trying to do is clean up as much of this as possible before public disclosure. So they had ultimately about a 5-day period between when they were first told of this incident and when they cleaned everything up. So they're going, okay, we've got 5 days to try and mop up as much of this mess as we possibly can. Now, when they found that, they could then go to those customers where they found fragments in cache and go, hey, we found something in your cache. You guys are now got to figure out what you do. Now, in those cases, it's pretty it's pretty explicit, right? It's like, yeah, here's your data. It's in the cache. We definitely know it's been leaked. We don't know how many people found it in cache. And in cases like that, companies need to look at it and go, well, maybe we should reset passwords because it could have passwords in it. Maybe we should invalidate active sessions, probably do both if you found your data in there. But what about companies where we haven't found them in cache? What about myself, for example? I run my blog, Have I Been Pwned, and a few other things through Cloudflare. Now, it's not too much of a problem for me because there's really nothing of an authentication sort of nature in there. When I think about the data that's actually sent to Cloudflare and GET requests, the impact is extremely limited, and that's extremely limited out of the extremely unlikely scenario that the data actually got leaked. But what about a company that has logins and authenticated sessions and all these sorts of things? And the reality of it is that we saw different approaches. So we saw some organizations like Creative Commons go, we're just going to password reset everything. We saw BugCrowd go, hey, we're going to invalidate sessions, not force a password reset. We saw other companies, and I list a bunch of responses on the blog, other companies go, well, we're going to send an email and say you should think about your security. Maybe you want to change your password, and sort of think about your general good practice stuff. The point is that there are a lot of different ranges of response. And this is good, right? This is companies looking at it going, we're going to consider the risk. We're going to make a call on what we need to do. Now, let's talk about the people that were losing their minds over this, because some people were absolutely freaking losing their minds over this Cloudflare thing and going, this just shows that either Cloudflare is crap or reverse proxies are crap or the sky is falling. And really, I think people were losing over their minds over what they didn't know. And this is a problem insofar as absence of evidence, so if we can't find you in a cache, for example, is not evidence of absence. It doesn't mean that you weren't leaked and your data wasn't exposed to someone else. But the challenge now is that you've got to make a call on what to do. And the folks that were losing their minds, a lot of them were saying that's it, you should reset every password, kill every session, and they totally missed the fact that this is a high friction process. It's high friction not just in terms of what it requires the organization to do, invest man hours, go through, reset stuff, but more importantly, it's also high friction in that you're asking every one of your customers, possibly millions of people, to go and perform an action based on a security risk. Now, many of them are not going to understand what reverse proxies are and why we need Cloudflare and all this sort of thing. So you run a risk, right? You run a risk of concerning customers. You run a risk of increasing the load on your support people. You run a risk of increasing the load on your system as everyone comes back and tries to reset passwords at the same time. There are negative aspects of doing this. And for everyone who said, if there's any doubt whatsoever, you should just err on the side of caution, it's not that simple because it's an equation, right? There are upsides and downsides to doing this. And it just concerns me. And if you read through the comments, you'll see some comments like this as well. Comments on the blog post. It concerns me that there are people that were just so black and white. As soon as there is any risk, go and do this. Now, how small does it need to get before the risk is so small that you don't do this? We're at like 1 in 3.3 million at the moment. What if it was 1 in 10 million, 1 in 100 million? Like how infinitely impossible does it have to get before you go, well, maybe not every risk is worth going nuclear on? Anyway, I think it's a very interesting discussion in terms of how organizations assess risk and likelihood and all this sort of thing and what they do afterwards. With the benefit of 1 week now behind us, the reality of it is, unless there's stuff that hasn't made the news, the impact of this has been really, really small. It was a big headline, and then it's pretty much died. I've not seen any follow-up on Cloudbleed in the last couple of days. I've certainly not seen any organizations go, yeah, we got owned. I did see a news story about someone selling data, which was apparently like 100 million accounts or something from some system they said they hacked with Cloudbleed. There's a lot of people selling data that will tell you anything that you want to hear in order to get money from you. So I haven't seen that one proven. That is extremely unlikely. So the bottom line, I wrap it up and then move on to the other cloud thing, is that this does seem to have been a storm in a teacup. We want it to be a storm in a teacup. We don't want this to be a big problem. bad bug, handled as well as it probably could be, and at the end of the day, something which is really now behind us. So anyway, argue with me in the comments if you don't agree with that, but I hope by verbalizing it, I've been able to convey a little bit more sentiment. All right, so I've been going for a quarter of an hour, and that was just on Cloudbleed, but it was a big thing. The other cloud thing, oh boy, CloudPets. Now, if you have not read what I wrote about CloudPets, now is a good time to pause, go and get a stiff drink, and then go and read the CloudPets thing, because this is kind of unfathomable. Now, I mentioned last week in the update I was working on something, and this was the thing. So I heard from someone probably early last week now, it was while I was in the US still, I heard from someone who occasionally sends me data, and they said, look, I've got this data, it's CloudPets, and I went, okay, what's a CloudPet? As many of you may be going now if you haven't seen the story already. And then I worked out that, all right, CloudPets are connected teddy bears. So what could go wrong, right? I can't see any problems with this at all. So they are connected teddy bears with microphones and speakers. It gets worse, bear with me. With microphones and speakers. And the premise here is that you could get your child to speak to the parent via the teddy bear. So imagine if it was me, right, and I travel a lot, and I'm overseas, and I want to speak to, say, my 4-year-old daughter. I would grab my phone, which I'm recording on, but it would look like that. I'd grab my phone, and I'd record a 10-second message on there, and then the light on the teddy bear would flash on the other side of the world, and my daughter would play the message back, and then she can record a message on the teddy bear, send it back to me. Now, if you're a technical person, you're probably listening to this going, oh my God, why did they do this? But put yourself in the shoes of your average everyday person, particularly those who aren't always close to their kids geographically, and you can sort of go, all right, well, I could see how that would be a kind of cute thing, right? Like this would be nice. But of course, when you connect your teddy bear to the internet, and it actually Bluetooth to your mobile, and then the mobile connected to the internet, so indirectly to the internet. But when you connect your teddy bear to the internet, you're going to be putting things on other people's web servers. And this is where the problems begin, because what I was sent was data from a MongoDB that was exposed publicly. Now, there's nothing overly unusual about a MongoDB being exposed publicly. It is alarming that that's the case. There's also nothing overly unusual about a MongoDB being exposed publicly without a password. We saw a lot of this happen around the start of Jan. So I saw a lot of exposed MongoDBs. People would use the likes of Shodan to query the API, find the database, and get the data out of the system. And this is clearly what happened. So I was looking at that going, all right, well, it's another data breach story. There are about 580,000 email addresses, bcrypt hashes of passwords. I'll start investigating this. And I'm in the US, in Dallas, investigating this. And in my workshop, there was a guy who was in the data breach. And this was amazing because I was sort of running the workshop and I was talking about the process as we went along. And I said, does anyone have a CloudPets account? This one guy who was right next to me, he's like, yeah, I do. So I went, okay, well, that's convenient. And he was able to help me verify it was legitimate because number one, he actually had a CloudPet. Number two, he gave me the password that he used. I asked him to change it before he gave it to me. Anyway, he gave it to me, and I was able to confirm that the bcrypt hash in the database was for that password. So I effectively just went, all right, create a one-word password list, and then use bcrypt to pass that in with his bcrypt hash, or rather use hashcat to pass it in with his bcrypt hash and crack the one password that was in there. So all it did is verify that the password was correct. So that was legit. And then as I started digging into this, and I'm just flicking through this post because there are so many points of continued fail, I started digging into it, and the guy that had sent me the data had sent multiple messages to CloudPets starting on the 31st of December 2016. And he's got these messages where, first of all, he tried emailing support@cloudpets.com because that is the email address on their support page. That didn't work. He says here, it seems dead, apparently just bounced back. Then he tries emailing the whois contact. That doesn't work. Then he tries emailing the hosting provider. That doesn't work. And by this time, he eventually gives up because this is over a period of, I think, about 6 days. So when I got there, so I went, all right, they're obviously unresponsive. He gave me evidence, so screen caps on the blog post of the emails. I got in touch with Lorenzo. Lorenzo writes for Motherboard. I worked with him on the VTech data breach story late 2015, which also involved kids. So I went, all right, well, he knows what he's doing. I've worked on a bunch of stories with Lorenzo. He's a good guy. I know he's going to do the right thing. And then he turns around and goes, oh, well, actually, somebody else emailed me about the same thing back in January. And there's screen caps in here that show the entire database schema, everything that's in there, how big it is, what all the collections are. And this guy had the same problem. This guy also tried to get in touch with CloudPets and couldn't. And in fact, in total, Lorenzo found a couple of different people who tried to get in touch with CloudPets, didn't work. And there's a pattern emerging here, right? Cannot get in touch with CloudPets. So Lorenzo tries to get in touch with him as well. When I say him, get in touch with CloudPets. I say him because ultimately the only person anyone's heard from is the CEO, and I'll get back to him in a moment. Anyway, Lorenzo can't get in touch with anyone there. He's trying phone numbers, all sorts of things. This is all documented in the blog post. Bottom line is, no progress. Now, I'm going on a bit, and there is stuff in the blog about this as well, but the next thing that was really significant is that I found that in the MongoDB, you've got a couple of things. You've got a total of about 800,000+ users. There are about 580 that were sent to me, but we've seen the definitions of the database that include the record counts in there that showed more than 800. You've got over a couple of million records for voice messages. Now, here's where we need to be careful with terms because this is where the present debate is coming up. There is a voice message table. There are more than 2 million records. Every single record points to a voice recording stored on Amazon S3. If you have all the data from the database, then you know where to get it from Amazon S3. Now, I went through and used the app in the way it was intended to be used and looked at where the requests were going. And when I loaded a voice message, it comes from cloudpets-prod.s3.amazon.com/guid.wav. So basically, if you know guid, you've got the file. Guess what the MongoDB contains? Now here is where things later on get very contentious. CloudPets eventually becomes contactable. I know, it's amazing, isn't it? Eventually becomes contactable. And they go, voice messages were not leaked. They go, well, the voice messages weren't in the MongoDB, but the MongoDB contains all the references to where the voice messages are in S3 storage. So you see the problem. I mean, you guys see the problem because you're listening to me, you're probably technical. But CloudPets, in their infinite wisdom, again, they weren't leaked, and they've made public statements to that effect as well, which is really alarming because now you've got parents thinking, well, all my things are okay, and they're not. Anyway, so it goes on. It gets worse. And as I was writing this, I literally said, it gets worse. It gets worse because even though they were bcrypt hashes, they had 0 password strength rules, so you could have a password of 123456. Guess what people did? They had passwords of 123456. So even though you got bcrypt, when you've got these very, very weak passwords, and people will always fall down to the lowest allowable password strength, generally speaking, there's a lot of single, double, triple character passwords. People will do this. Their own tutorial showed how to create a password of QWE. And if you look at your keyboard, you'll see why that's so popular. 3 letters or lowercase. Now, their terms and conditions said you shouldn't do that, but nobody reads terms and conditions, do they? And even if they did, they'd still do that because that's what people do, and we do have to protect people from themselves to some degree. Now, as we go on, many other screwy things. Their databases were called CloudPets-test, CloudPets-staging. There is some contention in the way they've written their responses saying that this wasn't production data. It had real people in there, right? So real email addresses, real passwords, real voice messages, references to real voice messages. It was also running on the same IP address as the service that the iOS app, and I assume the Android app and everything else, was talking to. So it's running on the production server. Now, if you want to have the argument that it's not production data, now you've got another problem because you're saying we've put non-production things on our production thing, and then you've got other problems. Now, looking at the database names, a bit of a problem happened, and this was around Jan 7, in that their databases kind of disappeared. Not all of them, right? Because the normal ones, the CloudPets test and staging disappeared, but then there's one called please_read that appeared. And not long after that, we had readme_missing_databases. And finally, pwned_secure_your_stuff silly. 3 ransom databases. And this was the indicator of compromise that we saw so much back in January when Mongo was getting owned. So the databases they had got deleted and multiple ransoms got left. Now, only a few days later, the Mongo was inaccessible and clearly the app still works. So someone has cleaned it up. Now, this is really significant because that doesn't happen accidentally. Ransoms don't just disappear and your real data doesn't come back. Someone saw that their data had been deleted, saw that there were ransoms, fixed it, and never told anyone. And this is a really critical part of the whole story because they knew about it and didn't disclose. It goes on and on and on. I think that's about as bad as it gets. Oh yeah, the stock price is kind of 0.44 cents a share. So they lost more than 99% of their share price since the middle of 2015. So basically they're broke as well. The registered address is up for lease. Might also explain why no one's answering the phones. So not real good for them there. Fast forward to the way this is all unfolding since the debacle. And they've just made these comments. When I say they, I think the only person who's made comments is the CEO. I don't know if there's anyone left, anyone other than him left. And they now seem to have a PR agency as well. But their comments along the lines of things like, the company never received the warnings. One of the people that reported it to Lorenzo actually has a Zendesk ticket for CloudPets, which shows that the warning is in there. It's actually in their ticketing system. So obviously they did record it. This individual also tried Twitter and Facebook and all sorts of other things to get in touch with them. So you just can't make that claim. They've also said the company found no evidence that any hackers broke into customer accounts. It's going to be really hard to tell if an attacker used a legitimate username and password, which they stole out of the database, which was public. So that's kind of crazy. It goes on and on and on. And a couple of the things that sort of really shocked me, the CEO said, we did have, and I'm quoting from the Twitters here, and I've linked to comments from journalists, etc. So I'm just relaying what I've seen. CEO says, we did have a reporter try to contact us multiple times last week. You don't assume, I'll rephrase that, you don't respond to some random person about a data breach. Yes, you do. Because if there's a data breach, you don't really care who tells you. There's a data breach. You have to go and do something about it. And just because they're a random person, and in fairness, pretty much anyone who's going to contact a company about a data breach is going to be a random person. You've got to take this seriously. And it's, the irony here is that it sort of contradicts some of the other statements about we did not know about it or we did not get notified, which is kind of screwy. And then it just goes on and on and on. And eventually they submitted something to the California Attorney General's office yesterday acknowledging the breach. I've got a list of 21 things that were wrong with that. And it was everything from claiming to not have known about the incident through to saying that Lorenzo is Canadian. Lorenzo's name is Lorenzo Franceschi Biccarai. I'm probably murdering that pronunciation. It doesn't sound very Canadian because it's not. All right? He lives in Brooklyn now. His bio on Motherboards says he's a defrocked lawyer from Barcelona, Spain, although he's actually Italian, which sounds like a name like that would come from somewhere like Italy. That sort of thing. They spelt the name of their own product wrong. They called it CloudPets. It's not CloudPets, it's CloudPets. And yes, it did get breached, and yes, the data is out there, and yes, people could get access to the voice messages. So I think to sort of start to get to the point of wrapping this up, and I'm sure that this will feature in many other talks and bits and pieces I write in the future, because it is endlessly good material for illustrating these sorts of things. One of the things that stunned me the most, they've sent out a notification. Everyone said, we had an issue. It's not serious. Don't worry about it. Anyway, one of the things that stunned me is that at no point do they apologize. So they don't say, we're really sorry we screwed up. And even by their own admission, they left their Mongo open. They know that. They're not even debating that. And at no point did they go, we're sorry about this. We made a mistake. We're going to try and do better. And instead, what they do is they link to reports of open Mongos getting owned as though it's a problem with Mongo. They talk about Mongo as being a third-party provider, as though it's their fault. Well, it's not. You installed the product and you misconfigured it. And even if it wasn't you and it's your vendor, and it looks like it was a Romanian vendor called Emredy, you're responsible, you're at least accountable for what your vendor does. You are the face of the public. You're going to be the ones that they contact and say, why did you lose the voice recordings? Let me rephrase it, because they keep doing this funny thing with the way they refer to it. Why did you put at risk the voice recordings of our kids and then not tell us about it, and then lie about it, and then try and downplay it? So it is just unfathomably bad. I don't think I've seen anything this bad in terms of company response. And trust me, I've seen a lot. I've dealt with hundreds of data breaches, but I've never seen denial and misdirection and downplaying to this extent. And that is a very unenviable title for them to have. I'm not sure if this is going to go any further. I am tempted to follow up and illustrate very graphically just how that data can be pulled. By the same token, it kind of feels like flogging a dead horse because it's all so obvious to so many people, and maybe we just need to let nature take its course now. We'll see. If they start behaving the correct way, then that will certainly make it easier. It will also make it easier if they keep making denials and issuing statements that are just not correct. All right, so that's that. That was two very long cloud things, but they were two really big things that did keep me enormously busy. A couple of other things very quickly to wrap up. I wrote a blog post just the day before yesterday, actually, which was about my marathon and a bit walk in San Francisco. And I wanted to talk, mostly it's photos of San Francisco, photos of a walk. Walking is awesome. And in fact, it's funny, when I go away, I've got these Withing scales, which stay at home. But they track your weight day by day, and I'll go away and then come back. And I've come back and I go, wow, I've lost like 2 kilos, even though I've been away drinking beer. But all the walking is enormously good. And then as I come back every single day, it's like, yeah, you just gained another 100 gram, another 200 gram. So I think it's probably telling me I need to do more walking at home. But some really good photos there, I think, of San Fran. It's an interesting place. I wrote about how I took my Lenovo Yoga with me. And for those of you wondering, that is the Yoga there. It, as I say in the blog post, it's kind of not the sort of machine I'd normally get. I'd normally get something chunky. So, for example, that is my old W540, which is sizable. In fact, it's literally double the weight, probably more, of the Yoga. But this is great because this I keep in my backpack, and it's like super thin, like so. And it does this really neat trick, which is it opens like a normal laptop, but then it tablets, right? And it's actually a really neat machine for doing things like watching movies on the plane, watching movies in hotels. I use it a lot when I travel just to sort of keep myself entertained, and it does the little sort of thing like that where you can A-frame it, which is kind of nice. So I have actually become really attached to this machine, which I didn't expect. It's still 16 gig and a quad-core i7, so it's actually a very neat machine. It's not a Xeon processor like my P50, but it is a pretty neat device, and I'm really enjoying using it. So I've got some pics in there of sort of the environments I use it on. There's one there when I was writing this blog post. I was sitting next to a kangaroo. It's kind of a neat thing to have happen down here. But this is great. Really like these machines. And then the very last thing is I've got Checkmarks on my blog, again, sponsoring for this week. So Checkmarks, who does some great static analysis stuff. I've done a few talks for them in the past, and those people are always really awesome to work with. So big thanks to them. They picked a good week because I got a lot of traffic from that CloudPets thing as well. So I hope Checkmarks is getting some love for supporting me. This has been the longest weekly update by far I've ever done. I hope it's been useful. I really wanted to try and add some more sort of thoughts and emotion to those two cloud things that doesn't always come across in writing. Thank you very much for sticking through to the end. I hope next week's actually going to be a bit quieter. See you guys.